The fall of 2022 in Moscow, Idaho, was like any other. A crisp chill lingered in the air, the kind that settled over the small college town as golden leaves littered the sidewalks and students filled local cafes with the hum of conversation. It was a place where life moved at an easy rhythm, football games on weekends, late-night study sessions, and house parties that spilled into the early morning hours. But all of that would change one November night, when a quiet street near the University of Idaho became the site of unimaginable horror. In the early morning hours of November 13, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were brutally murdered inside their off-campus home on King Road. The attack shocked not only the university community, but the entire country. What happened inside that house in the span of mere minutes would send waves of fear, confusion, and grief through Moscow and beyond, igniting one of the most intense criminal investigations in recent memory. That night had started like so many others in a college town. The victims had spent the evening out with friends. Madison and Kaylee, lifelong best friends since childhood, had gone to a local bar before stopping at a food truck in the downtown area. Xana and Ethan, who were dating, attended a fraternity party just a short walk away. By 1:56 a.m., all 4 were back at the house on King Road. It was a typical college weekend night, laughter, messages exchanged, music faint in the distance until everything fell silent around. 4 a.m., investigators would later determine that the killer entered the 3-story house under cover of darkness. The attacker moved swiftly, deliberately, and with a kind of controlled rage that left behind devastation. Each of the victims suffered multiple stab wounds. One endured more than 50. The violence was so severe that blood seeped through floors and walls. It was a scene so horrific that seasoned detectives described it as haunting, one that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. 2 other roommates were home that night. They survived, one of them waking at one point to noises, what she thought were sobs, or perhaps the sound of someone moving through the house. When she opened her door, she saw a figure clad in black clothing, wearing a mask that covered his mouth and nose, walking past her. Frozen in shock, she watched as he slipped out the sliding glass door and disappeared into the night. She locked herself in her room, not yet aware of what had just unfolded upstairs. The call to 911 didn't come until almost 8 hours later. By then, the house was eerily still. Officers who arrived that morning were met with a scene of chaos and tragedy that defied comprehension. The small community of Moscow was shaken to its core. Parents pulled their children home from campus. Fear spread like wildfire. Who could have done this, and why? Theories began to swirl. Was it a targeted attack? Was there a stalker? Could it have been random? In those early days, investigators kept many details close. They had no weapon, no suspect, and few answers. But they did have one vital clue, a leather knife sheath found beside one of the victims. On it was a single male DNA sample. That evidence would soon become the key that unlocked the case. Detectives began piecing together surveillance footage from neighborhoods surrounding King Road. Multiple cameras captured a white sedan, a Hyundai Elantra, driving repeatedly past the victims' home in the early morning hours of the murders. The vehicle's movements were suspiciously precise. Slow passes, turnarounds, brief stops. When investigators cross-checked vehicle registrations and university parking databases, one name stood out: Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old Ph.D. student at Washington State University, just a 15-minute drive away in Pullman, Washington. Kohberger wasn't an ordinary student. He was studying criminology, the very science of crime, evidence, and behavioral analysis. He had a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's in criminal justice. Those who knew him described him as intensely analytical, sometimes awkward, and deeply fascinated by criminal behavior. In class discussions, he was known to dissect crime scenes with obsessive detail, exploring how offenders thought and how investigators tracked them. It was as if he was studying not just theory, but the mechanics of the hunt itself. As police built their case, they quietly began tracking his movements. Cell phone records showed his device pinging near King Road dozens of times in the months leading up to the murders, as if he had been surveilling the area. The night of the killings, his phone went dark around 2:47 a.m., powered off or placed in airplane mode, and turned back on again just before 5 a.m. miles away. It was a digital gap that aligned almost perfectly with the window of the murders. DNA testing confirmed what investigators suspected. The profile from the knife sheath was a close match to DNA collected from trash at the Kohberger family's home in Pennsylvania. The odds of it belonging to anyone else were astronomically low. By late December 2022, law enforcement had their suspect. At 1:30 a.m. on December 30th, a SWAT team arrested Bryan Kohberger at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. The man accused of slaughtering 4 college students had returned home for the holidays, seemingly attempting to resume a normal life as if nothing had happened. The arrest sent shockwaves through both Idaho and Washington. Kohberger's classmates were stunned. Professors who had taught him recalled his meticulous nature and quiet intensity. One former peer described him as brilliant but unsettling. Others remembered his piercing stare, a look that made them uncomfortable, though they couldn't explain why. It would later emerge that Kohberger had applied for an internship with local police, expressing interest in how law enforcement used technology and data to track criminals. The irony was chilling. When the affidavit for his arrest was unsealed, the details were damning. It described the white Elantra circling King Road multiple times before the attack, phone records placing Kohberger near the crime scene, and DNA evidence linking him directly to the sheath. There was no direct eyewitness to the killings, but the mountain of circumstantial and forensic evidence was immense. Prosecutors were confident they had their man. In early 2023, Kohberger was extradited back to Idaho. His first appearance in the Latta County Courthouse was calm, almost detached. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit, he stood before the judge as the charges were read: 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. The courtroom was packed with reporters, students, and grieving family members. Parents of the victims sat stone-faced, listening as the man accused of taking their children's lives answered in a quiet voice, "Yes, Your Honor." Over the next year, the case dominated headlines. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. True crime communities online debated every fragment of evidence. How could someone with Kohberger's background, someone who studied crime and justice, commit such a heinous act? Did his education give him a false confidence, a belief that he could outsmart investigators? Or was it something deeper, a dark curiosity about human suffering, twisted into violence? Inside jail, Kohberger maintained the routine of silence. He rarely spoke to other inmates, requested books on criminology, and spent hours pacing in his cell. Jail staff described him as quiet but watchful, always observing, always analyzing. He followed the media coverage of his own case, seemingly aware of the national fascination surrounding him. Prosecutors built their case methodically. They outlined a timeline: Kohberger leaving his apartment in Pullman around 2:45 a.m., driving toward Moscow, parking near King Road, committing the murders between 4 o'clock and 4:25 a.m., and returning home just before sunrise. Surveillance footage showed his Elantra making the drive back to Washington. His phone reconnected to the network around 5 a.m., pinging near his residence. The evidence painted a chilling picture of premeditation and control. The one question that loomed largest, the question that haunted both investigators and families, was why. There was no clear link between Kohberger and the victims. He had never been seen with them. There were no text messages, no DMIs, no record of contact. It seemed as though he had chosen them at random, or perhaps had fixated on one of them for reasons known only to him. Without a confession, the motive remained a void, a black hole that no amount of evidence could fill. Months later, whispers began to surface that Kohberger might have stalked the victims online. Investigators reportedly found multiple photos of at least one of the women on his phone. Some sources claimed he had visited the King Road area several times before the murders. If true, it painted the portrait of an obsessive mind, methodical, detached, calculating. While Kohberger awaited trial, the families of the victims became pillars of strength within their shattered community. They established foundations, held vigils, and spoke out about their loved ones. Kaylee's father, Steve Goncalves, became one of the most vocal advocates for justice, frequently attending court hearings and pushing for answers. The Chapin and Kernodle families remembered Ethan and Xana as inseparable, full of light and laughter. Madison's friends described her as the soul of every room, vibrant, kind, and fiercely loyal. These were not just names and headlines. They were sons and daughters, best friends, siblings, lives abruptly stolen. As the case advanced toward trial, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. But in 2025, everything changed. Bryan Kohberger entered a plea deal, guilty on all charges. In exchange, the state agreed to remove capital punishment from consideration. In a calm, deliberate voice, he admitted to the killings. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sobs of family members. The judge described his actions as unspeakable evil, sentencing him to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Even in confession, Kohberger offered no explanation. No apology, no motive, just silence. The questions that had haunted Moscow for nearly 3 years remained unanswered. Why them? Why that night? And what was going through his mind as he stalked the hallways of that quiet Idaho home? The house on King Road was eventually demolished in 2024. For many, it was an act of closure, a way to erase the shadow that had fallen over the town. But for others, it felt like a loss of evidence, a final erasure of the place where 4 lives had ended. The memory, however, could not be demolished. Moscow had changed forever. A sense of safety that once defined its college community was gone. By the summer of 2025, as the dust of the legal proceedings settled, what remained was a mix of sorrow and bewilderment. The case was technically closed, the killer confessed, sentenced, and imprisoned for life, yet it didn't feel finished. There were too many unknowns, too many questions that no one could answer. Kohberger never spoke publicly again after sentencing, retreating into the isolation of prison life. Some said he'd achieved what he wanted, infamy. Others believed he acted out of compulsion, the culmination of a long descent into darkness. For the families, the sentence brought relief but not peace. They would carry the weight of that November night forever. And for Moscow, Idaho, the echoes of the crime still lingered, in the empty spaces of campus halls, in the flicker of candlelight vigils, and in the silent road where it all began. That night was more than a murder scene. It was a turning point, a moment when the quiet normalcy of a small college town collided with the face of calculated evil. The story of Bryan Kohberger and the 4 murders is one that still grips the nation, not because of what is known, but because of all that remains a mystery. And as the years pass, one question continues to echo. What turns a student of justice into a master of destruction? In the weeks that followed the murders, Moscow transformed from a quiet college town into the epicenter of a national media storm. News vans lined the streets, reporters stood in front of the yellow-taped house, and speculation swirled across every platform imaginable. Students fled campus in fear. Some dropped out altogether. Others locked their doors at all hours, sleeping with lights on, haunted by the thought that the killer could still be among them. Law enforcement, local police, the Idaho State Police, and the FBI worked around the clock, racing against panic and pressure. Each day without an arrest deepened public anxiety and criticism. Behind the scenes, the investigation was a labyrinth. Detectives combed through thousands of tips, phone records, and digital footprints. They collected DNA samples from hundreds of people, interviewed friends and witnesses, and pulled surveillance footage from every camera in a 5-mile radius. They even examined reports of stalkers and strange vehicles around campus in the months leading up to the murders. Every detail mattered, no matter how small. But for weeks, there was no clear suspect, no arrest, and no sense of direction until a small piece of evidence began to shift everything. That piece was the tan leather knife sheath found beside one of the victims. On the metal button snap of that sheath, forensic analysts discovered a single trace of DNA partial male profile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to enter into national databases. When no match came up, investigators decided to build the genetic profile manually, using forensic genealogy. They traced the DNA through public databases, connecting it to distant relatives. Slowly, a name began to emerge: Bryan Christopher Kohberger. Once that name surfaced, a new world of evidence opened. Kohberger owned a white Hyundai Elantra, the same type of car spotted multiple times near the King Road house on the night of the murders. Cell tower data placed his phone near the area on multiple late nights before the killings, suggesting pre-attack surveillance. Detectives quietly began to track him, placing him under physical and digital surveillance while piecing together a complete timeline. Investigators learned that Kohberger was a doctoral student at Washington State University in Pullman, less than 10 miles away from Moscow. He lived alone in an apartment near campus, where neighbors described him as polite but distant. One neighbor recalled that he often carried heavy trash bags late at night, always wearing gloves even when it wasn't cold. Another said he'd seen Kohberger cleaning his car obsessively in the days after the murders, wiping every surface meticulously, as if erasing invisible fingerprints. Detectives also obtained his class and employment records. He worked as a teaching assistant for the university's criminology department, grading undergraduate assignments on criminal behavior and investigation techniques. Some students later said he was unusually harsh when grading papers, while others described him as awkwardly self-assured, talking to himself during lectures. Several weeks after the murders, he suddenly began handing back grades inconsistently, appearing distracted and agitated. Professors noted the change but didn't yet know why. As law enforcement built their case, they watched Kohberger drive across the country for winter break. On December 13, 2022, he and his father began a cross-country trip from Washington to Pennsylvania, where his family lived. Unmarked FBI and state police vehicles tailed them the entire way. Along the route, body cam footage later revealed, Indiana State Police pulled over their car twice in 1 hour for following too closely. During both stops, Kohberger sat quietly in the passenger seat while his father spoke to the officers. The stops were intentionally made to record his demeanor and obtain a better view of his hands and arms for potential defensive injuries. He appeared calm, expressionless, just another traveler on the highway. When they finally reached Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, agents waited for a warrant. Days later, the order came through. In the early hours of December 30th, a tactical team surrounded the Kohberger home. At 1:30 a.m., officers stormed inside, finding Bryan awake, wearing latex gloves and rummaging through the trash. They arrested him without incident. In the garbage outside, investigators recovered items that contained DNA consistent with the same male profile found on the knife sheath. It was the breakthrough the entire country had been waiting for. News of the arrest spread like wildfire. The mugshot of Bryan Kohberger, pale, gaunt, with sunken eyes filled screens across America. Overnight, he became the face of one of the most disturbing crimes in modern college history. While many celebrated the capture, others were stunned by the details. A criminology student studying the psychology of murder had allegedly committed one of the very acts he devoted his academic life to analyzing. The irony was almost cinematic, and yet the reality was horrifyingly real. After his arrest, Kohberger waived his right to fight extradition, telling the judge he wanted to return to Idaho to be exonerated. He arrived in Moscow under tight security in early January 2023, escorted by law enforcement officers wearing body armor. The courtroom was packed to capacity for his initial hearing. Parents of the victims sat in the front row, holding photos of their children. Kohberger stood silent as the judge read the charges: 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. His expression remained blank, eyes fixed on the floor. When asked if he understood the charges, he nodded once. In the months that followed, prosecutors began revealing portions of the evidence that tied him to the crime. They detailed the DNA match, the vehicle footage, and the phone data. The state's case portrayed a man who had studied his victims, stalked their home, and executed the crime with precision. The narrative was chilling, a criminology scholar who believed he could commit the perfect murder. But the defense had its own strategy. Kohberger's attorneys argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial, the cell phone data inconclusive, and the car footage ambiguous. They questioned the handling of genetic genealogy, claiming it invaded privacy and lacked transparency. They also argued that law enforcement had prematurely fixated on Kohberger, shaping the investigation around their theory rather than letting the evidence speak for itself. The courtroom became a battleground not just for facts, but for philosophy, science versus psychology, data versus doubt. Meanwhile, the public obsession with the case deepened. True crime enthusiasts dissected every document released. Online sleuths mapped timelines, and social media threads spiraled into endless speculation. Every leaked photo, every snippet of new information reignited debate. Some fixated on his face, searching for signs of evil. Others debated whether the crime had been driven by jealousy, hatred, or obsession. A smaller group insisted he'd been framed. For months, the story consumed the internet, transforming from tragedy to national fixation. Inside his jail cell, Kohberger remained eerily consistent. Guards said he rarely spoke, spent hours reading, and maintained meticulous hygiene. He refused interviews and avoided contact with other inmates. Reports claimed he organized his meals by color, counted his steps daily, and never showed emotion. Some speculated he was studying his own confinement, turning his incarceration into another case study of criminal behavior. As investigators combed through his electronic devices, they found searches that deepened the sense of unease. He had looked up news coverage of the murders, tracked updates on the investigation, and even searched for information about the victims themselves. It appeared that he followed the investigation in real time, analyzing how close police were to catching him. In one chilling detail, data revealed that his phone had returned to the area of the murders hours after the killings, as if to observe the aftermath. Whether it was curiosity, arrogance, or something darker, no one could say for sure. While the legal system moved slowly, the emotional toll on the victims' families was immeasurable. They sat through hearings, statements, and filings, enduring months of delay. Each motion and appeal prolonged their grief, but they persisted. Kaylee's family demanded transparency. Ethan's family spoke about love and forgiveness. Xana's family remained fiercely private, shielding themselves from the media storm. Despite the pain, they stood united in one goal: justice. The motive remained the great unanswered question. Why would Kohberger, a man with no criminal record and a promising academic career, commit such an atrocity? Psychological experts weighed in with theories. Some believed he was driven by feelings of inadequacy or rejection. Others speculated about a fascination with dominance, control, and fear, the very emotions he'd studied academically. A few pointed to the possibility of narcissistic or antisocial tendencies, suggesting he might have seen the murders as an intellectual experiment, a way to test the boundaries of investigation and detection. None of it could be proven, yet the theories painted a chilling psychological portrait. As spring turned to summer, the legal proceedings continued. Kohberger's defense filed motions challenging the death penalty, arguing procedural violations in the grand jury process. The prosecution countered with its intent to pursue the harshest possible punishment. Tension filled the courthouse at every hearing. But in the background, quiet negotiations began, talks of a plea that would spare the victims' families the trauma of a lengthy trial. By July 2025, the rumors were confirmed. Bryan Kohberger would plead guilty. The announcement shocked many who expected a drawn-out court battle. When he appeared for the plea hearing, the courtroom once again filled to capacity. The air was heavy with emotion. Family members of the victims clutched hands, tears streaming silently as they prepared to hear the man responsible for their loss admit to his crimes. When the judge asked how he pleaded to the first count of murder, Kohberger spoke in a flat tone. Guilty. One by one, the remaining charges were read, and each time his response was the same: guilty. There was no hesitation, no visible remorse. He never looked toward the families seated just feet away. For them, those words were both relief and agony. They finally had acknowledgement, but not understanding. During sentencing, the judge described the crime as cold, calculated, and cruel beyond measure. He noted the premeditation, the brutality, and the utter disregard for human life. Each victim's name was read aloud, and with each, the courtroom grew heavier. The sentence was 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for burglary. Kohberger remained expressionless as the gavel fell, sealing his fate. Yet even as justice was served, the deeper mystery endured. Why did a man obsessed with understanding crime decide to create one? What did he hope to learn from it? Was it power, control, the thrill of defiance? The absence of answers made the case more haunting than ever. To this day, no confession letter, journal entry, or recorded statement has explained his motive. All that remains is speculation and silence. The aftermath reshaped Moscow forever. The University of Idaho constructed a memorial garden on campus to honor the 4 students. Candlelight vigils became annual events, drawing thousands. The community rebuilt itself piece by piece, but the fear never fully left. Even after the King Roadhouse was demolished, its memory lingered like a ghost, the address synonymous with tragedy. In prison, Kohberger lives under close supervision, isolated from the general population. He spends most hours in his cell, reading, writing, and occasionally corresponding with attorneys. Guards say he rarely shows emotion, his face unreadable, his words measured. He speaks politely, almost academically, even when discussing mundane topics like meal schedules or library access. It is as though the analytical student remains inside him, trapped within the same mind that engineered so much horror. For those who survived that night, the trauma lingers. The surviving roommates have since left Moscow seeking anonymity and healing. They carry the unimaginable burden of having lived through something so monstrous. Their courage, though often unseen, stands as a testament to resilience. Years later, the legacy of that night endures not only in court documents or documentaries, but in the collective consciousness of a generation. It's a story about fear, grief, and the thin line between curiosity and obsession. It forces us to question how far human fascination with evil can go before it becomes part of it. The murders of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin will forever be remembered, not just as victims of a single night, but as reminders of the fragility of safety, the unpredictability of darkness, and the resilience of those left behind. And as the world continues to search for meaning in what happened, one truth remains. Sometimes evil wears the face of intellect, hides behind education, and walks unnoticed among us until it decides to reveal itself. The night of November 13, 2022, may have ended in silence, but its echoes still travel through the halls of memory, whispering the same unanswerable question: what drove Bryan Kohberger to cross the line between student and killer? In the aftermath of Bryan Kohberger's arrest, the long shadow of that November night refused to fade. For the people of Moscow, healing was complicated by curiosity. Everyone wanted to understand how a man who looked so ordinary, who spoke in academic terms about justice and human behavior, could have carried out such violence. The more investigators and journalists uncovered, the more disturbing the picture became, not of a spontaneous act of rage, but of methodical preparation by a mind both intelligent and detached. Through digital forensics, detectives slowly pieced together Kohberger's life in the months before the killings. His phone records revealed late-night drives that often traced the same routes, long loops through rural roads connecting Pullman to Moscow, sometimes ending near King Road. GPS data placed him near the victim's house at least a dozen times before the murders, usually in the dark hours when the town slept. To prosecutors, this pattern was not coincidence. It was surveillance. He had studied his victim's home like a researcher gathering data. Neighbors later recalled seeing the same white Hyundai Elantra creeping along the edge of the King Road neighborhood on several occasions that fall. One resident even mentioned a car idling near the intersection around 3 a.m. weeks before the killings, its headlights off. It hadn't seemed alarming then. Students came and went at all hours, but in hindsight, it felt chillingly deliberate. Inside his Pullman apartment, the signs of his personality were subtle but revealing. Investigators described the space as sterile, almost lifeless. A single mattress on the floor, no decorations, no photographs, no sign of warmth. A small computer desk sat near the window, perfectly organized, a laptop, a few notebooks. A single pen laid precisely parallel to the edge. The refrigerator contained little more than protein drinks and bottled water. It was as though his life had been stripped of humanity, existing solely for observation and control. When agents searched his computer, they found traces of his online activity that suggested deep curiosity about violent crime. He had joined academic discussion boards about serial offenders, commenting on topics like offender profiling and the psychology of predation. On one forum, he once asked participants to describe their emotional state before, during, and after committing crimes, framing it as part of a research study. It was a chilling echo of his later actions, as if he had been trying to quantify what he intended to experience. The timeline reconstructed by investigators showed a man moving with surgical precision. On the night of November 12th, Kohberger's phone pinged near his Pullman apartment until shortly before 3 a.m. Then, as if by design, it went dark, powered off completely. His car left the parking lot minutes later. Security footage from multiple locations captured the white Elantra traveling toward Moscow, crossing the state line at 3:29 a.m. At 4:04 a.m., a camera near the victim's neighborhood recorded the vehicle turning onto King Road. 25 minutes later, it sped away. During that same window, the surviving roommate heard strange sounds, a thump, a dog barking, someone crying softly. She peeked through her bedroom doorway just in time to see a figure in black, tall and lean, wearing a mask that covered his mouth and nose. He walked past her without a word, eyes fixed forward, gloved hands at his sides. That fleeting moment may have saved her life. Perhaps he didn't see her, or perhaps he chose not to. Moments later, the sliding glass door opened, and the house fell silent again. Forensic analysis later showed that the attack likely began on the top floor, where Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen slept in the same room. Both were found together, suggesting they had been ambushed in their sleep. The assailant then moved to the second floor, where Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin were. Evidence indicated Xana was awake. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms suggested she had fought fiercely. Ethan's position near the doorway implied he had tried to confront the attacker. The brutality was staggering, multiple fatal stab wounds delivered with a fixed-blade knife. No defensive wounds were found on the top floor, meaning the first two victims never had time to react. Back in Pullman, Kohberger's phone turned back on around 4:48 a.m., pinging south of Moscow along a back highway. Surveillance showed his car returning toward Washington just before dawn. At 5:30 a.m., the Elantra pulled into his apartment complex, headlights off. Neighbors later said they heard footsteps above them that morning, pacing back and forth. Then, water running in the bathroom for nearly an hour. When police eventually recovered his car in Pennsylvania, they noted that it had been scrubbed clean inside and out. Every surface wiped down, every crevice vacuumed. Despite the effort, they still found a few stray fibers, a single hair, and faint traces of blood under the floor mat that would later be tested. Even the knife sheath, which he had left behind, seemed out of character, a rare mistake from someone so calculated. Detectives speculated he hadn't noticed it drop in the chaos or that the Velcro had come undone in the struggle. Psychological experts studying the case suggested that Kohberger's fascination with criminology might have evolved into something darker. Over time, an obsession with control and intellectual superiority, he wasn't a criminal seeking thrill or gain. He was a man who wanted to understand violence so intimately that he eventually became it. His education, rather than deterring him, may have given him a sense of mastery over investigative methods. In his mind, he could commit the perfect crime, leaving no trace, no witnesses, and no motive. But perfection, like control, is an illusion. One tiny trace of DNA, one camera in the right place was enough to unravel everything. As prosecutors gathered their evidence, they also began to construct a psychological narrative for the jury. They described a man isolated from emotion, socially awkward yet intensely self-focused. He was known to correct professors in class, interrupt peers mid-sentence, and obsess over small details in conversations. When others spoke about compassion or empathy in criminal behavior, he would steer discussions toward efficiency and process, how offenders executed their crimes rather than why. One of his former classmates recalled that he seemed irritated whenever people spoke about morality. "He didn't seem to believe in good or evil," she said later. He only believed in cause and effect. That detached worldview, investigators theorized, may have allowed him to see his victims not as people, but as variables, components in a test of his own intellect. While the world watched the legal proceedings unfold, a quieter battle played out behind the scenes, the internal reckoning of the Moscow community. The University of Idaho worked to restore a sense of normalcy. Counseling centers extended hours, professors offered remote classes, and students organized vigils that filled the campus with candlelight. Photos of Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan glowed from every corner. People left flowers at the memorials, whispering prayers and apologies. There was grief, but also defiance. They would not let fear define their town. In time, more details about Kohberger's personal life emerged. Friends from high school remembered a boy who was shy, overweight, and bullied. In his senior year, he lost a significant amount of weight and began projecting a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Some classmates recalled that he could be cutting in his words, using intelligence like a weapon. Later, in college, he reportedly struggled with social isolation and an intense need to feel intellectually superior. Former acquaintances described him as awkward in conversations, his eyes cold and unblinking, his tone rehearsed. One woman who briefly met him at a social event said she felt something off. Immediately, an emptiness she couldn't explain. All these fragments created the image of a man constantly seeking validation but incapable of connection. For someone obsessed with understanding human behavior, he seemed completely detached from it. That contradiction fascinated psychologists analyzing the case. They debated whether his education was a shield to hide his instability or a catalyst that fueled it. Whatever the truth, his studies in criminology seemed to have blurred into his identity. By the time he entered the Ph.D. program, it wasn't just an academic pursuit, it was a self-worth. In prison evaluations, he was described as methodical, polite, and emotionless. He followed routines with precision, rising early, exercising in silence and keeping his cell immaculate. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was in articulate, deliberate sentences. Officers noted that he addressed them respectfully, even formally. But when they mentioned the murders, his expression hardened. He would simply say, "I can't discuss that." To some, his composure was unnerving, the calm of someone who understood the system too well. The plea deal in 2025 closed the legal chapter, but not the emotional one. For the families, it was a bittersweet end. The death penalty was off the table, but so was the uncertainty of a trial. They would not have to relive the evidence in court, yet they would also never hear him explain himself. Some called the plea an act of cowardice, a way to escape public scrutiny. Others saw it as the final act of control, a last opportunity for Kohberger to dictate the terms of his fate. Years later, the case continues to ripple through true crime discussions and academic circles alike. It is dissected in classrooms and documentaries, studied by criminologists who search for insight into how education and obsession can intersect so destructively. Many agree that Kohberger's case represents a modern paradox. A man who studied law and order only to defy both, who sought knowledge about justice but produced only tragedy. In Moscow, life slowly returned to rhythm, but not the same one. The town carries an invisible scar. Students still walk past the site where the King Roadhouse once stood, now an empty lot framed by grass and trees, and feel a chill. Parents still call their children more often, urging them to stay safe. And every November, the town gathers in candlelight to remember 4 names that changed everything. For the world beyond Idaho, the story remains haunting because it feels too real, too close to the ordinary. Bryan Kohberger was not a drifter or a lifelong criminal. He was an educated man from a small town, someone who could have been a classmate, a neighbor, even a teacher. His face, clean-cut and emotionless, defied the caricature of a killer. That is what unsettles people most. The reminder that darkness can live quietly among intellect and routine, unnoticed until it chooses to reveal itself. As time passes, the questions remain unanswered. What was he thinking during those hours in the car before the murders? Did he feel fear? Excitement? Nothing at all? Did he ever plan to stop? Or was this only the beginning of something larger that was interrupted by his arrest? No one knows. Perhaps no one ever will. For now, what endures is the memory of 4 young lives full of promise, cut short on a cold November night. Their legacy outshines the man who tried to extinguish it. In classrooms, families, and communities across the country, their story serves as a reminder that even in the face of calculated evil, humanity, compassion, and unity can rise stronger than fear. And though the crime is solved and the killer confined, the night of horror in Idaho remains frozen in time. A story not just of death, but of how fragile the boundary can be between the study of darkness and the moment one steps into it. As months passed and the courtroom lights dimmed, the echoes of that November night still lingered in Moscow, Idaho. The quiet town that once buzzed with student laughter had grown guarded, its residents forever marked by what had happened. People who used to leave doors unlocked now double-checked them each evening. Porch lights that once flickered off after midnight now stayed burning through dawn. And though the man responsible sat behind bars for life, the sense of unease had never truly left. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime that haunted people, it was the why, the question that seemed destined never to be answered. The forensic teams who first entered the King Roadhouse carried the memory of what they saw like a weight that never lifted. Many of them described the scene later as the most harrowing of their careers. There were rooms drenched in silence, mixed with the metallic scent of blood and the ghostly reminders of lives once vibrant. They moved carefully, documenting every surface, every footprint, every streak that told part of a larger, horrifying story. From those fragments, they began reconstructing a timeline second by second. In one upstairs bedroom, they found Madison and Kaylee side by side, still together in death as they'd been in life. Their phones lay within arm's reach, never used. On the second floor, near the sliding glass door, Xana's room told a different story: overturned furniture, defensive wounds, evidence of a fight for survival. Ethan, nearby, had likely rushed in to help her, unaware of what awaited. In the corner of the room, lying partially under Xana's body, was the tan knife sheath that would become the case's turning point. Forensic specialists handled it as though it were made of glass. Under ultraviolet light, they located a faint fingerprint and a small sample of DNA. It was a single mistake, The kind even meticulous killers rarely realize they've made. Weeks later, when that DNA matched a familial sample from Kohberger's trash in Pennsylvania, the puzzle finally began to align. Every meticulous movement, every carefully plotted route, had been undone by the smallest trace of human imperfection. The team also examined microscopic fibers, shoe prints, and digital residues. The pattern on the sole prints found inside the house matched a type of boot later traced to a brand sold in Pullman. Hair samples collected from the victim's bedding contained multiple DNA contributors, one of which could not be excluded from belonging to Kohberger. Surveillance footage supported the theory that he'd parked a few hundred feet from the house, approached through the darkness of the backlot, and slipped in through the sliding door without a sound. For digital analysts, the cell phone data painted an equally compelling picture. Every ping, every brief connection to a nearby tower was mapped into a living timeline. The data showed how Kohberger's phone had traveled from Pullman to Moscow dozens of times before November 13th. Investigators believe those late-night drives were reconnaissance, practice runs to understand the neighborhood, traffic flow, and timing. On the night of the murders, his phone's signal vanished right as he left his apartment. When it reappeared, it was moving south along Highway 95, far from the scene. That digital silence, that carefully timed gap, spoke volumes. Back in Pullman, his behavior after the murders seemed to straddle the line between control and unraveling. Neighbors remembered him taking his garbage out to the bins at odd hours, wearing latex gloves. When police later sifted through those trash bags, they found nothing incriminating, every item wiped clean or sealed. The sheer discipline of it all unsettled detectives. It wasn't the panic of a man in hiding. It was the precision of someone determined to erase every trace. And yet, as investigators later discovered, he couldn't help but follow his own case. His phone history included dozens of searches about the murders, the victims, and updates from law enforcement press conferences. It was as if he couldn't resist watching the chaos he'd created unfold in real time. Each headline, each news clip, each rumor online, he tracked them all. In one disturbing instance, his phone was logged searching for the victims' names on the very morning after the killings, while their bodies were still being discovered. Even more chilling were the findings on his laptop. Analysts uncovered essays and notes that appeared to outline his thoughts on criminal evolution, behavioral hierarchy, and the satisfaction of dominance. One document, incomplete and fragmented, seemed to explore the idea of taking power from those who believe they are untouchable. It wasn't a confession, but it offered a window into a mind teetering between intellectual fascination and moral collapse. During the investigation, detectives also combed through interviews with those who had known him. Old classmates from Pennsylvania described a boy who had once struggled with weight and self-image, a loner who transformed in late adolescence after a drastic weight loss. After that transformation, he seemed obsessed with control over his body, his environment, and eventually, over others. Friends recalled long monologues about psychology and human nature. "He didn't talk with you," one former peer said. "He talked at you like you were part of an analysis." In Washington, colleagues in his graduate program offered a more complex view. They described him as highly intelligent but socially cold. He often stayed after class to debate professors, challenging every assertion. He wanted to prove himself the smartest person in the room, not out of curiosity, but necessity. One student later admitted that when news of his arrest broke, she wasn't entirely shocked. "He was brilliant," she said, "but there was something in his eyes. They didn't match the words he spoke." At the same time, his outward life remained eerily ordinary. He graded papers, met professors, and attended lectures about criminal profiling. To those around him, he seemed consumed by his research, never knowing that, in secret, he was living it. The duality of Bryan Kohberger became one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. The man who studied how killers think while quietly becoming one. Psychologists who later reviewed the case suggested that this duality wasn't accidental. It was an identity built on contradiction. Kohberger sought power through intellect, but intellect alone no longer satisfied him. In the sterile confines of theory, there was no adrenaline, no proof of superiority. To someone like him, understanding evil wasn't enough. He needed to demonstrate mastery over it. The murders experts believed were his attempt to convert theory into experience, a catastrophic blurring of academia and obsession. The months after his sentencing saw waves of analysis across television networks and university panels. Everyone wanted to decode the psychology behind the man now serving 4 consecutive life sentences. Some framed him as a cautionary tale about detached intellectualism, the danger of studying empathy without possessing it. Others focused on societal isolation and untreated mental illness. But none of these explanations could bring back the lives lost, nor could they fully explain the void at the center of his motives. For the families, the pain was an everyday reality. They continued to attend memorials, speak at events, and remind the world who their children were beyond the headlines. Kaylee's parents became advocates for victim rights reform, pushing for faster investigative transparency in violent crime cases. Madison's family launched a scholarship for students pursuing careers in education, the path she'd once dreamed of following. Xana's and Ethan's relatives often appear together, united in their grief, honoring the young couple's love story that ended far too soon. When the King Road house was demolished, many locals gathered quietly nearby. Some cried. Others stood in silence, watching the heavy machinery tear through the structure. It was more than just a building. It was a symbol of shattered innocence. The ground beneath it became sacred to the community. Months later, the university announced plans to turn the area into a remembrance garden, a place for reflection rather than fear. Even after the physical traces were gone, the story refused to fade. Filmmakers, journalists, and authors reached out to families seeking interviews. Some declined. Others agreed, hoping that telling the story might transform horror into awareness. They spoke not about the killer, but about the victims, their laughter, their ambitions, their humanity. Slowly, public focus began to shift away from the man who had taken everything and toward the lives he could never truly erase. Inside the Idaho State Correctional Institution, Kohberger adjusted to life under permanent confinement. His cell, a small rectangle of gray concrete, mirrored the sterile emptiness of his old apartment. Guards noted that he read constantly, academic journals, psychology texts, even philosophy books. He rarely interacted with other inmates. Occasionally, he wrote notes to his attorneys, neatly printed, precise, emotionless. He had become a ghost of his former self, existing only as a curiosity to the outside world. Psychiatrists who observed him from afar debated whether he felt remorse. Some argued that his silence was a form of control, that speaking would give others power over his narrative. Others believed he was incapable of genuine empathy, viewing his crimes through a detached analytical lens. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. What was certain was that he never expressed apology or regret. To him, the murders were a completed equation, an experiment whose variables had played out exactly as he designed. And yet, even in the cold logic of his world, something had gone wrong. The experiment had failed. He'd been caught, undone by the very science he thought he understood best. That failure, perhaps, was his greatest punishment, to live knowing that despite all his education, he wasn't beyond the reach of human error or justice. Back in Moscow, the community began to heal, inch by inch. Students returned, classes resumed, and the rhythms of campus life began to pulse again. But every November, as autumn leaves once again swept across the streets, the air carried a different weight. People remembered. They lit candles, shared stories, and gathered near the new memorial garden. The names Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan were spoken softly, reverently. Parents held their children a little tighter. Friends looked after one another. And while fear had once filled the town, resilience had taken its place. The tragedy that began with horror slowly transformed into a movement of unity, a reminder that even in the darkest acts of cruelty, the strength of human compassion can rise above. Across the country, criminology departments began re-examining how they teach subjects like offender profiling and criminal motivation. Professors emphasized ethics more strongly, addressing how curiosity about deviance must always be balanced by empathy. Some used Kohberger's case as a stark warning. Intelligence without morality becomes its own form of danger. The very field he had once hoped to advance now studied him as a cautionary example. Still, for those closest to the victims, no academic reflection could fill the absence. The empty chairs at family dinners, the birthdays that never came, those were the reminders that justice, though delivered, was never complete. Time moved on, but grief doesn't follow a calendar. It lingers quietly, reshaping itself into strength, love, or sometimes just endurance. Years after the case closed, Moscow felt almost normal again. New students arrived, unaware of the pain that had once gripped the town. But locals remembered. They spoke of it not as a story of terror, but of resilience. The scar was permanent, but it had healed into something meaningful, a reminder of the community's endurance, and of how fragile and precious everyday life truly is. In the end, the story of Bryan Kohberger and the 4 murders became more than a criminal case. It became a study of human duality, the collision between intellect and instinct, order and chaos, control and consequence. It reminded the world that evil doesn't always announce itself with rage or madness. Sometimes it hides behind calm eyes and quiet logic, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The night of horror in Idaho will never be forgotten. The world may analyze, debate, and theorize for decades, but for those who lived it, the truth is simpler and far more painful. It was not just a tragedy, it was the shattering of trust, the moment innocence met its end. And while Bryan Kohberger spends his life behind bars, the legacy of the 4 he took from the world continues to shine brighter than the darkness he created. As the wind moves through the pine trees that surround the University of Idaho, the memorial lights flicker gently each November night. In those quiet moments, the town remembers not the killer, but the laughter that once filled its streets. It remembers the friends who never came home. It remembers the lesson written in sorrow, that evil can touch even the safest places, but love, courage, and remembrance will always outlast it. Years have passed since that cold night in Moscow, but the story of Bryan Kohberger and the 4 lives he destroyed still ripples through time like a scar that refuses to fade. What began as a brutal crime in a quiet college town has evolved into a modern parable, one about obsession, intellect, and the fragility of safety in a world that believes it understands evil. The murders shocked America not just because of their savagery, but because of what they revealed. That darkness can live quietly beside us, dressed in reason, disguised as intelligence, and walking through the same hallways as everyone else. The coverage of the case became a reflection of society's fascination with crime itself. Television networks dissected every court document, podcasts released multi-hour breakdowns, and YouTube channels analyzed every angle of surveillance footage. Reporters stood outside the Latah County Courthouse in the freezing air, repeating the same questions again and again. Why did he do it? How did no one see it coming? What turns a criminology student into a killer? The attention was relentless. For months, Kohberger's face appeared everywhere, the dark, expressionless mugshot that became infamous. Yet as time moved on, public opinion began to shift. Many started to focus less on him and more on the victims, whose lives were far more deserving of remembrance. Each of them had dreams, ambitions, and laughter that filled rooms long before that night turned them into headlines. Madison Mogen was 21, a marketing major with a love for music, laughter, and friendship. Her best friend Kaylee Goncalves was also 21, recently graduated and preparing to start a new life in Texas. The 2 had been inseparable since childhood, bonded by humor and a shared sense of adventure. Xana Kernodle, 20, was known for her strength and warmth, the kind of friend who made others feel seen. She and her boyfriend Ethan Chapin, also 20, had been dating since the spring. Ethan was one of triplets, a dedicated student-athlete from a close family who spoke often about how proud they were of him. Together, the 4 of them embodied everything bright and promising about youth. That is how their families have chosen to remember them, not as victims but as lives overflowing with possibility. Their names now live on through scholarships, memorials, and advocacy foundations that promote student safety and mental health awareness. The University of Idaho built a serene remembrance garden on campus, its pathways lined with the victims' favorite flowers. Each November, candles flicker beneath engraved stones bearing their names, the glow cutting through the long Idaho nights. In many ways, their memory has become the heartbeat of a town learning to heal. The families remain connected, united by unimaginable loss yet strengthened by the love their children shared. They meet at events, hold one another through anniversaries, and continue to speak the victims' names aloud, a defiance against silence, against forgetting. Their strength has inspired others across the country who have faced tragedy, reminding the world that grief can transform into legacy. Meanwhile, the fascination with Bryan Kohberger continues, though in a quieter, more analytical form. Criminologists and psychologists still study his behavior, hoping to understand the roots of his transformation. How does a student of justice turn into the very evil he once sought to analyze? Some believe he represents the ultimate narcissist, a man who saw others only as objects in an experiment of control. Others point to years of isolation, rejection, and an unyielding obsession with superiority. They describe him as a predator who didn't kill for passion or revenge, but for validation. His crimes, they argue, were a twisted attempt to prove his own intellect by testing whether he could outsmart the very system he studied. If that was his plan, it failed spectacularly. The very science he admired, DNA technology, digital forensics, data analysis, became the tools of his undoing. The irony isn't lost on anyone. A man who believed he could master criminology was ultimately defeated by it. His downfall is now taught in classrooms as a case study in arrogance. A reminder that no one stands above evidence, no matter how clever they believe themselves to be. Inside prison, Kohberger remains largely silent. Reports describe him as reserved and emotionless, maintaining an almost robotic routine. He eats little, exercises alone, and spends long stretches reading and writing. The few interactions he has with staff are polite, even courteous, but devoid of warmth. He never mentions the murders, never acknowledges the victims. To this day, he has offered no statement of remorse, no explanation, and no insight into his motives. The silence is perhaps his final act of control, a refusal to give anyone the satisfaction of understanding him. For some, that silence is infuriating. For others, it is telling. It suggests that Kohberger may never have had a coherent motive to begin with, that his reasons lived entirely within a warped internal logic, one that doesn't translate into human empathy. Perhaps there was no grand reason. Perhaps the murders were the inevitable result of a mind untethered from compassion, lost in its own obsession with dominance and power. Psychologists who have studied similar cases point out a recurring pattern: individuals who intellectualize empathy but do not feel it. They learn to mimic emotion, to analyze morality as a construct, but they lack the capacity to experience guilt. They understand pain only as a concept, not a consequence. In that light, Bryan Kohberger becomes less a mystery and more a reflection of a psychological void. A man who believed knowledge could substitute for humanity. Yet even within that void, fragments of humanity still echo. The irony of his life sentence, to live endlessly within walls, stripped of control, stands as a poetic inversion of his obsession with power. Every day behind bars serves as a reminder that he failed in his ultimate pursuit. His story ends not in triumph or understanding, but in confinement and silence. Outside those walls, the legacy of the 4 students continues to grow. Their classmates graduated, their friends built new lives, but none have forgotten. Each year, candlelight vigils draw hundreds of people to the university's lawn. Names are read, moments of silence held, and tears mix with laughter as memories of the victims are shared aloud. It is a bittersweet ritual, a reminder that while tragedy can break a community, love can rebuild it stronger than before. For the town of Moscow, healing has come in layers. Businesses reopened, students returned, and life continued, though never quite the same. The horror of that night reshaped the town's sense of security, but it also forged resilience. Residents look out for one another now, not from fear, but from unity. The collective trauma has transformed into a collective strength, a quiet vow to protect the peace that was once so easily taken for granted. The King Road lot, once marked by police tape and sorrow, now stands as a small, peaceful patch of grass. On calm evenings, the wind carries the scent of pine and lilac through the neighborhood, and for a moment, it almost feels as though time has healed what it can. The laughter that used to spill from that house has long since faded, but the memory of those who once lived there remains woven into the air. As the years pass, documentaries, books, and analysis continue to surface, each trying to frame the story in a new light. Some focus on the investigation, the DNA, the phone data, the forensic trail that brought him down. Others explore the psychology, the warning signs, the lessons to be learned. Yet beyond the science and speculation, the heart of this story remains painfully simple. It is about 4 young people whose lives were stolen, and a community that refused to let them be defined by the man who took them away. In a broader sense, the Idaho murders forced America to confront its fascination with true crime. Millions followed every update, shared every theory, and debated every detail. But amid the frenzy, some began to question why society is so drawn to stories of horror. Is it curiosity? Empathy? Or something darker? A collective need to stare into the abyss and reassure ourselves that we are nothing like the people who dwell there? The case became more than a tragedy. It became a mirror, reflecting both our need for justice and our unsettling attraction to evil. Through it all, the message that endures is not about Bryan Kohberger. It is about Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan. Their names are the ones carved in stone, their memories the ones that inspire acts of kindness, scholarship, and remembrance. The killer's legacy will fade into infamy, but theirs will live on in the people who carry their light forward. Some nights in Moscow still feel different. When the wind rushes through the streets and the trees sway against the moonlight, there's a lingering heaviness not of fear but of remembrance. The community has learned to coexist with the memory of what happened, to transform pain into resilience. The story of that night no longer belongs to the darkness that created it. It belongs to those who survived it, those who remember, and those who choose to live in defiance of evil. In the end, perhaps that is the true legacy of Idaho's Night of Horror, that from the ashes of unspeakable cruelty rose a testament to love, strength, and endurance. The killer may have taken 4 lives, but he could not take their spirit, nor the compassion that blossomed in their absence. The world will continue to study him, to analyze his motives, to turn his name into data and theory, but the people of Moscow, and those who love the victims, know better. They know that the most important part of this story is not the darkness that fell, but the light that continues to rise from it. And so, each year, as November's chill returns and the candles are lit again, the message remains the same. Evil came quietly one night, but it did not win. In the gentle glow of the memorial garden, where 4 names shimmer under the Idaho sky, the silence speaks not of fear, but of peace. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The whisper of laughter, the echo of friendship, and the unbroken promise that love, no matter how wounded, always endures.